Okay, everyone, I think we should get started since we're already a few minutes behind. I'm Tom Wormuth. I'm a professor of history here at Marist University, and I want to take the opportunity to welcome everyone here tonight to the keynote panel of the 2026 New York History Conference, which is off to a great start. 250 registrants, a big portion here. There were more before we went to the reception, but they're coming in still. So, very special welcome to everyone. Let me just describe a little bit about this session and what we're doing. Of course, this is focused around the book Fire and Freedom, The American Revolution in New York, just released by Cornell University Press. It's been out maybe 2.5 weeks at this stage. The end of May is when it was published. And what this session is about is a look at there are a variety of different chapters in this book. There are 8 different chapters looking at many different aspects of the American Revolution. It's not fully inclusive. There are things that are not covered there, but there are lots of things which are. The purpose of our session here today, and I'll point out there's like 3 things we want to do. First, I'm going to introduce everyone so that they just don't sit here awkwardly while I'm talking on this. But then I do want to talk a little bit about the process by which we reached this session, this program connected, of course, to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in New York. Then third, these are all authors. These are about half of the authors from the book. Have about 5 to 7 minutes. We can have some leeway either way, I'm sure, to talk about their research, their chapter, significant findings, and things along those lines. I want to follow up with a few questions to see how it fits into the larger understanding of the American Revolution that we have here in 2026, this semi-cinquentennial year. And then once we do that, open it up to everyone here in the audience, whether it's questions, comments, ideas for new research. It can be ideas being thrown back and forth at each other out here as well, since I know there are many, probably a majority of this crowd are focused on the revolutionary period, at least in terms of this session. So let me first just take a moment to introduce everyone that are to my left. And right to my left is Benjamin Karp. He's the Daniel Lyons Professor of American History at Brooklyn College, and he also teaches at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's the author of The Great New York Fire of 1776, a lost story of the American Revolution, which was published 2 years ago by Yale University Press. To his left is, I did these things out of order, Ilana Krischer. Actually, I was about to say she was a visiting assistant professor of history at Marist University, but actually you're at Siena starting in the fall. A friendly competitor. Ilana has published in the Journal of the Early Republic and Iroquois. Her research interests include Native American history, 19th century history, and settler colonialism. Then third person over is John Cording at St. Thomas Aquinas College, specializing in Loyalist studies. He's working on an open access database of New York Loyalists that will be launched in 2026. That's this year. So in the next few months, this will be launched. And then Chris, I have it all written out here. Chris Minty, just to John's left. He's a digital editor at the University of Virginia and the author of Unfriendly to Liberty, Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City, published 2 years ago, again by Cornell University Press as well. And all the way down the end, we've communicated quite a bit back and forth. We're born in the same area, but this is the first we met. Dylan Streifenreiter is an assistant professor of history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and his current scholarship focuses on state formation and governance in the era of the American Revolution. He's published in New York History. It's a great article, and it's also published here in this book. So special welcome to all of our participants tonight. So now this is where I have to take about 5 minutes to talk about how this project came about. Here we are in 2026, right at the time of the semi-cinquentennial, the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, as well as the Declaration of Independence. This project began really, though, about 3 years ago. This started in a conversation just about this time. It was the end of May, early June of 2023. I was having a meeting with Devin Lander and Jennifer Lemack. Jennifer Lemack is the chief curator at the New York State Museum. Devin Lander is the historian of the state of New York. Also then Robert Childs at the University of Maryland, all three who are co-editors of New York History, the New York History Journal, but also at the meeting, at the first or then mutual other meetings, were Chris Proslavsky, the program director of the Hudson River Valley Institute, Andrew Villani, the executive director, the person overseeing the Hudson River Valley Institute, and Tisha Dunstan, the program director at the Hudson River Valley Institute. So those folks, we started to meet, and what we were coming to terms with about 3 years ago is that, look, we saw that the 250th anniversary was on the horizon. It was coming. There was no way to avoid that. And there were lots of different things which were developing around the state, around the country, right? It affected the entire country. And many of these things were public-friendly types of events, a variety of symposia, things like that. But what we wanted to do was, we're scholars. We wanted to produce something scholarly related to the 250th anniversary as well. We wanted to have something for future generations to remember what happened around the time of the 250th. And so some sort of scholarly academic work we wanted to pass on. We noted back in 1976, at the time of the bicentennial, New York History, the journal, in an earlier iteration, had a special issue on the bicentennial, on articles which were just focused on the American Revolution. So we wanted to do something along those lines. That started a discussion. The discussion started with perhaps a certain portion of a upcoming version of New York History that grew into something bigger, a special issue of New York History. And then that grew even further at the work of India Miraglia, who from Cornell, who I believe is here, and also Megan. I forget Megan's last name. She's left Cornell University Press, but I have it written down here. Megan Levinson. They said, this is a book. You need to turn this, you need to see clearly, it's not just a journal issue, it's a book. And so we went down this path of a process to get writers to submit applications, to submit proposals for a book which was going to be focused broadly on the American Revolutionary period, right? From the mid-18th century, even well into the 19th century. The revolution broadly defined. We had no limits or specifics in terms of topics. It could be something on political history, social history, cultural history, military history, and we received proposals in all of those areas. In fact, at the start, we received about 50 different proposals for inclusion in this special issue, which we were calling, by that point, of course, a book. By the time that we had a group of historians look at those applications, those proposals, it whittled down to about 20 or 25. Those turned into papers which were submitted to the committee. And that's where historians in the state of New York really chimed in, because more than 30 historians in New York, mostly focused on New York and the American Revolution, did peer reviews and peer readings. Every one of the articles was reviewed by at least 2 reviewers, some 3. Ultimately, we had it down to, just to keep that moving, about 12 or so articles, but we only had room for 7, and that was a clear mandate. So a few very good articles did not quite make it, but 7 excellent articles did, and that's what we're going to hear about tonight. Now, the reason we wanted to make sure that we did something which recognized New York's participation in the revolution is because New York's participation in the revolution was so critical and so crucial. We know that the revolution in terms of the war for independence began in New England, right, in Massachusetts, Lexington Concord, Boston Tea Party, all the things that go with that. We know it ended in Virginia with the Cornwallis surrendering at Yorktown to George Washington and the French. But for a good part of those middle years, from 1776 through 1783, because from 1776 to 1783, the British had control of Manhattan, right? They had taken it over. And that's where the war moved, right? It moved into New York and into New Jersey. And for the rest of the war, that was some of the major conflicts that were taking place. The British wanted New York. They wanted New York City, but more than that, they wanted the Hudson River Valley. They wanted that region, that natural transportation system, the major commercial system, this incredible, bountiful region producing all of this food. They wanted to control the valley, and George Washington wanted to keep them out of the valley. But year after year, there were invasions and battles back. But what it revealed again was the important role that New York played, not only at the time in terms of the way various folks saw what was important about the war, but looking back, we want to make sure that New York gets its just due, as it should, and it will, as you take a look at this book. So that was really kind of the organizing reasons in terms of why we wanted to make sure that there was something which would, once we hit 2027, we didn't want, and of course the revolution shouldn't be just judged by 2026, 2027 will be Saratoga and all of these other 79, Stony Point, 1780, the Clinton, 1779, the Clinton Sullivan invasion, as we've heard about earlier today. So there's plenty on the horizon as well. So that's the background. So the goal here, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is to have each of the authors talk about their contribution to this, what their approach was. I would say, since we're going to hear about 5 different topics here, I think it might also be useful just to speak both broadly, but also maybe kind of on not only this topic, but why you chose this topic, why you're interested in it. I know some people were already working on these projects beforehand. Other people began to work on them once the call for papers went out. So it'll be a different situation for each. But why don't we start? Oh, one last thing. Although it feels I've already said a lot of last things. In terms of, again, once we conclude this, there will be that opportunity for folks again to ask questions. But Ben, how about if we start with you? But you need a mic to do that, don't you?
Yeah, sure. I'll get started. So this is going to be weird to ask. Heard of the burning of New York City in 1776. All right, this is a room of professional historians, right? But so a lot. But when I talk to public audiences, not a lot of hands, even though a fifth of New York City is burned, right? Like, just a couple of months after the Declaration of Independence, and we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of that. So I wrote this whole book about that, and I don't want to talk about that, but a big, I think, scholarly contribution to that book is the way the Continental leadership basically distorts the story of that fire. And in the original manuscript of the book, I think I cut 50,000 words from my original draft. And a big chunk of those 50,000 words was a historiographical essay that I wrote, because I was also interested in the way that historians then subsequently treated the fire from the 1780s and 90s all the way through the end of the 20th century. And so I still have a component to that I haven't published about how biographers of Washington and historians of the Revolution kind of treat the fire. There's fascinating stuff with that. But the piece that I wanted to contribute to a volume like this is how New York historians specifically treated the fire. And so my essay is really not just about the revolution, but the memory of the revolution and how it changes throughout New York's history. And it's really interesting, right? Like, as New York kind of starts out feeling sort of a little bit insecure about the fact that it was occupied and trying to fluff up its own story about how patriotic it was, nobody's got room for a story about how Washington might have burned New York, or about how New Yorkers might have burned their own city to deprive the British of a naval base, right? Nobody wants to tell that story. And then, gradually over time after the Civil War, you do have a couple of Civil War veterans who write histories of New York who are like, yeah, well, that kind of thing happens during war, and like we saw this in Moscow, and okay, right? Like, maybe we did this. But even though, and at that point also, there have been a bunch of, over the years, there are a bunch of kind of printed primary source dumps that are done, right? Like Valentine's Manual, the Henry Johnston campaign of work on the Battle of Long Island, Stokes's iconography. You have all of these anthologized stories about the fire that don't just present the American version of things, but also all of these British and loyalist accounts who are like, oh yeah, the Americans totally did it. And so even though you have primary sources kind of saying, yeah, actually kind of looks like the Americans did it, and even though you have occasional historians here and there saying, yeah, it kind of looks like the Americans did it, the mainstream histories written by New Yorkers still are like, oh no, it was probably an accident, or maybe it was, these random miscreants who did it, right? Like Clifton Hood calls them the patrician historians, right? And he says they have a lot of staying power, well into the 20th century, right? As you start to have like these dirty immigrants coming into New York, my own ancestors, right? And all this like volatility and class conflict, right? Like there's a desire to tell a story of New York, of old New York, that is as sanitized as possible in order to make New York feel safer for these New York patricians. And so you get to World War II, and people are still kind of telling the story of the fire as if it has no significance at all. So I really wanted to kind of dig into that and talk about why that story had such staying power. I'll stop there. Is that about 5 minutes? I don't know. Okay.
Back. Actually, you've set off in my mind a couple of questions I have, but we'll come back to them so that everyone first gets the opportunity to do their do a short presentation, and that will be kind of the structure too. To as you come up with questions of each other's talks, feel free. Ilana?
All right, so my chapter is about the Seneca experience with the 1779 Sullivan-Clinton expedition, how that campaign failed to fulfill its goal of the complete destruction of the Haudenosaunee and the confiscation of their lands, and how the United States and New York then had to turn to treaty making as a tool of dispossession. And at first, this treaty making was very aggressive and it was very one-sided. But as the new and weak United States was grappling with threats from Native nations, threats from across the Atlantic, and internal disputes with individual states, by the end of the 18th century, the federal government was forced to recognize Haudenosaunee sovereignty in the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua. So a couple of these treaties that I write about end up creating some protections for Seneca lands, sometimes intentional, sometimes not. And in part, this allows the Senecas to maintain their sovereignty and also parts of their land base as, the push for dispossession grows in the 19th century. So by bringing the story to 1794 instead of ending the story in 1783, the chapter revises older scholarship that claims that the end of the American Revolution meant a period of permanent decline and division for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And the chapter also highlights that the American Revolution was very much a war of territorial aggrandizement. And then a main motivating factor for a lot of colonists to join the revolution was to claim native land. And that's evident in the Declaration of Independence, in the actions of the leaders and those on the Sullivan-Clinton expedition, and in how New York and the United States present themselves to the Haudenosaunee after the war. And we can talk about this later, but Tom, you mentioned in the introduction this kind of historiographical issue of home rule versus who rules at home. And I don't think you can talk about that without seeing that native land is at the center of both of those conflicts. And I'm happy to talk about that more later, but will not pass the mic. You have your own mic.
And John and Chris, since you both co-authored, I guess you go in any order that you would like.
So we are your Van Buren boys. We co-authored a chapter on allegiance on Long Island during the Revolution. And where did we start this project? It stems partly from the book that I published a few years ago with Cornell. Buried at the back of that book is a short appendix where I detail it's a collective biography of close to 10,000 loyalists. And during the course of the research for that book, I was looking for oaths of allegiance, and I found one on Long Island and did this collective biography, and then it kind of sat for a while. But I had this database in Microsoft Access, and if you've ever used Microsoft Access, you know it's kind of clunky. It's not very accessible, and it's very difficult to put online. But I would field sort of research questions every now and again, people asking me like, is this person in your database? And I had to go have a look. And someone got in touch with me from St. Thomas Aquinas College called Heath Bowen, and he wanted to talk to me about doing a project on loyalists related to the American Revolution. And we were fortunate enough to get a Gardner grant from the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation to digitize the database and put it online. And so we started doing that. We put these around 9,000 loyalists online. We eventually found about another 2,000 more. Put it online, and it is live now. We went live early. It's at americanloyalist.org. One of the documents that we have is Oath of Allegiance from Long Island. And Jack and I were working on it. Jack helped transcribe these documents, and we started looking at some of the names that were popping up. And we noticed some of the names were kind of familiar. And there were members of the cult perspiring had taken the Oath of Allegiance on Long Island. And we thought, that's quite interesting, because I know someone who wrote a book with Cornell in 2023 who used that Oath of Allegiance to identify loyalists. Are these people loyalists? So that's how we started the book, and then, or started the chapter. And then Jack and I we wanted to do a collaborative process. So maybe you can chat.
Yeah, so when we found those names in these oaths, there we go. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So when we started transcribing these documents and we found like the names Sulla Strong, the Rowe brothers, even I think Townsend as well, we kind of wanted to look deeper into on Long Island especially, like how the inhabitants of Long Island really feel about their allegiances to either the Conference of Congress or the king. So a lot of the work I did was kind of looking at the cultural history of the inhabitants of Long Island. And we kind of found the pattern of behavior that we really just kind of about maintaining their way of life. The chapter kind of starts off in like the early 1600s when the Puritans settled Long Island to kind of contain the Dutch expansion in Manhattan. And we found out that the people on Long Island were more kind of associated to the people of Connecticut. They considered themselves to Connecticut rule for a long time before New York then reestablished control over Long Island. And we saw just a lot of the ensuring that the communities stayed monogenetic to maintain that lifestyle. Because even as New York re-exerted control, the Long Islanders still maintained the Connecticut style life, and they didn't really interact as heavily with New York City as the rest of the colony. And that kind of carries over when you then look at the Continental Association, who signed that. A lot of the names that we saw in the Continental Association, they immediately signed the Oath of Allegiance that was presented to them. So I kind of just used that to just show that, especially on Long Island and possibly throughout the rest of the colonies, these people who are signing these oaths may not necessarily be doing it for their ideological perspective. Some of them obviously did, but the large majority of them could have just been doing it because that's the only way that they were able to maintain their way of life. So we kind of question the validity of these documents in assigning people's loyalty.
I think that what our chapter does is challenge the binary of loyalist v patriot, and shows that it's much more complex. And that, so Jack mentioned that people who took the Oath of Allegiance also signed the Continental Association. And it's not quite person for person, but it's very, very close. And these people just wanted to live their everyday lives. And when you're presented with the Oath of Allegiance by the Royal Governor and the British Army right on your doorstep, I think you might fall in line. And this research for this chapter is replicated in other research in other areas of New York, and that's something that we're hoping to explore as well with the Loyalist Institute at STAC. I think we can move on.
Yeah. No, that was perfect. Thanks. Dylan?
Good evening. So my chapter is a part of a wider project on state formation. And so it got started, actually, I was lucky enough to have a fellowship at the David Library, which is at the American Philosophical Society, a place that anyone that's interested in studying the revolution should apply for. They have great fellowships. So I was able to spend a month in Philadelphia working through some papers that I didn't quite have access to when I was finishing my dissertation. There's the Nathaniel Green papers they're edited volumes, but many of the papers that are not Green himself speaking, or letters that were sent to him, didn't actually make their way into the volumes. They're sort of abstracts, or there's a whole other set that are at the American Philosophical Society that didn't make it into those edited papers. And what I was coming across was challenges and struggles of supplying the army that was needed to win independence. And much of the conflict that was happening was between local governmental officials. And so by 1777, 78, I think there's oftentimes when we look at the formation of a state, we can look to the creation of constitutions. Constitutions are often sort of seen as that's how you create a government. You write a constitution and you pass it. But as with the US Constitution, much of figuring out the machinery of government and how you actually govern happens in the years after the Constitution is written. And the same can be said for the state of New York, in which, in the aftermath of writing this document, the machinery is not really there. And so they do that by passing statute laws and trying to figure out how to govern. And one of the questions that I'm asking is, how do you create a strong government that's capable of securing independence and defeating the British military at the height of one of its powers? So the title of my chapter, The Propriety of a Vigorous Government, is actually a quotation from the wartime governor, George Clinton, in which he is frustrated with these local officials who seem to be defeating the efforts by the centralized state. So it's sort of my chapter looks at the question of how do you get centralized directives to be carried out when they're passed in a place, whether that's Manhattan or whether that is in Poughkeepsie or Kingston. How do you ensure that these local officials are actually carrying out these laws? And so the area that my chapter focuses on is the question of impressment, that is the forceful taking of military supplies needed to wage the war, in which you need the cooperation of the state, needed the cooperation of local officials. And so it looks at the process as to how do you go about to ensure that those local officials actually carry out the letter of the law and not their own interpretation of it, or just ignore it altogether, which happens quite frequently in the early stages of the war.
Dylan, thank you very much. You know, just listening to the various presentations, there's a couple questions, individual questions that have come up, but I'm also thinking of a broader question on how, you know, we're referring to everything, or I have anyway, as the American Revolution, right? We have some understanding, I think, of what that is. This a massive event of political, economic transformation, which takes place in the second half of the 18th century. Obviously an issue of home rule, but then again, who should rule at home? And I'm just wondering if you could just speak briefly to, do your topics, are they part of the revolution per se, whatever that means? And I think you're gonna, I've given you the opportunity to interpret that yourself in terms of that, or are they things that are happening? I mean, some of the things sound very clearly, yes, very connected to the struggle with Great Britain, obviously loyalism and so forth. But I'm just wondering to what degree are some of these things, would they be happening if there wasn't a war for independence that was underway? Would there be, how do they become part of the revolution itself, or are they things which are happening at the time in which a war is being fought? I don't know if that's clear in terms of, and I don't know who would want to start in terms of that. Oh.
I mean, in my book, at least, I think I'm arguing that the fire is the product of a kind of extremist version of the war, right? Like, we really need to deprive the British of this city. We are going to burn it. And, you know, wars create chaos zones. And so you're going to see things like that happen in war. Although, on the other hand, there are tons of fires throughout New York State's history that happened in times of peace and at times of war. So, you know, but as long as you take the position that the fire was not an accident, that it wasn't the result of a bolt of lightning or something, it does kind of seem as if, right, a wartime situation definitely makes that kind of thing more possible. But my essay is also about how you sell a version of the revolution to subsequent generations and children and stuff that you know, that doesn't encourage them to further violence, right? And instead kind of says, oh, this is a safe memory for us to celebrate on the 4th of July. So the revolution is something that needs to be perpetuated. And that is something we have to think about this year, in the year of the 250th anniversary of independence, right? Like, what is the version of the revolution that we are presenting to our divided public, right? Like, or what are the different messages about the revolution that people are getting? And is there a way to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and have some kind of unitary idea? Or maybe we never did, and that's worth investigating further too. Yeah.
Just a follow-up on that. I thought that was excellent description of that. From reading your chapter, I'm wondering why, though, if I'm remembering correctly, the British really didn't do much of an investigation of this when it happened, maybe much later on. And I'm wondering, why wouldn't they have done that, unless it was already kind of perceived and understood that who was responsible? And another two questions. The other one being one of, to what degree is it a matter of, and I think you did allude to this in the chapter as well, that George Washington can't be connected to any fire that has broken out in New York City because his troops were retreating out of the city. And well, anyway, you could just address it both.
I mean, the Washington thing is its own whole thing, and it actually might be the last essay I ever write on the fire. Like, it's amazing. There are some biographies of Washington that cover the whole correspondence between him and Congress. When he's like, "Hey, Congress, can I burn the city?" And Congress is like, "No, don't do that." And he's like, "Okay." And, "Oh, isn't Washington great? He listens to civilian authority. This is like," and then those histories will not actually mention that a fire then subsequently happened, right? Like a couple of weeks later. And well, I mean, to be fair to some historians, the letter where Washington writes to his cousin, "Oh, Providence or some good honest fellow did what we didn't think to do for ourselves," that doesn't seem to be available to historians until after 1949. And ever since then, some historians have been willing to kind of say ironically, "Oh, Washington is kind of winking at this fire." But to get to your question, what your earlier question was about, tell me. All right. Oh, the British do investigate it twice, but there's not a lot of evidence about the 1776 investigation, because Howe seems to have held on to those records himself, and then they went up with the rest of his private papers in 1826 in Westport, Ireland. So there was an investigation in 1776, but a lot of the guys changed clothes with one another. And I think the British kind of thought, well, we executed a bunch of people on the spot. We're trying to reconcile these Americans to their allegiance. We can't just keep prosecuting people. So they did kind of give up. Right? They didn't really have great evidence. They kind of felt sheepish about the summary executions. And so they were like, all right, let's forget about it for now. Then Carleton comes back in 1783 and tries to investigate it again, because he has a belief that, like, America might not survive. And so, like, I think he's trying to publicize the fire as a way of still getting people over to the British side, or at least as a counterweight. Right, because the Americans are kind of saying, well, we're not going to compensate the loyalists for any of their lost property. You burned all of our towns. Franklin especially is like, why would we do that? And so I think Carleton comes back with, well, if I show everybody that the Americans burned New York City, maybe that'll like kind of balance the scales. So they interview a bunch of people, but it's October of 1783. The whole thing is over. And so then the final text of the peace treaty comes in, and it's like, all right, what's the point of this? And then they never, like, those 40 depositions that Carleton's men take, they're not in the British public archives. They remain in the papers of the clerk, Ward Chipman, who moves to New Brunswick in Canada. And then later on, the New Brunswick Historical Society donates them in the 1890s. And so they're in the New York Historical Society in a private collection. But they never do anything with it. So the British do investigate it twice. And they also publish their own newspaper accounts being like, oh yeah, the Americans totally did this. But then, like, you have to remember, like, there's a war going on, and like the pace of events just sort of overtakes it, right? Like, Howe still has to kick Washington out of Manhattan Island. He's not done. So he, like, everybody in 1776, at least, everybody kind of has to move on. And the British are just not as good at propaganda as the Americans are. If the British had been Americans, they would have just, like, shouted about this until they were blue in the face. But the British just aren't, they don't stick to their guns about that. Whereas the Americans are willing to complain over and over every time the British burn a town. They'll even make stuff up like, oh, it was the British that burned Norfolk, Virginia, even though Virginia later demonstrates that like 85% of Norfolk was burned by Virginia, North Carolina militia. Like, so, right, like, so, but yeah, no, the Americans are great at it. They've got control of most of the newspapers. They know what they're doing as far as like just getting Americans angry enough to not want to go back to the British.
Did anyone want to add anything to that or question further? Oh, well, on that one, I do happen to have one more, which none of you can see, I realize now. Basically what it is, I'll read it, and I'm not moving any closer to the edge of the stage there, though. This is from the 1926. It's the official, it's kind of the equivalent of what we're doing here with this book. It was the New York State Archives Office of Office of the New York State Office of Archives, the Division of Archives and History. So the American Revolution in New York, its political and social significance from 1926. And Alexander Flick, of course, the historian of the state of New York, is the author of this. And this is kind of what's out there on the 150th anniversary, 1926. And what does it say about the revolution? When all the factors are taken into account, the American Revolution was on the whole not an extremely radical movement. Except for the sundering of political ties with the British Empire, the old usages were not torn up by the roots. So basically, puts it right out there that it was not. He says it's not extremely radical. I don't know what the difference between extremely radical and radical are, but that essentially there was much more in terms of continuity. Now, what I don't have is a slide to move it up to 1976, the bicentennial, in which, again, the equivalent of this book, and it would have been the commission at the time, I'm trying to think of his name. He was the Librarian of Congress for many years. Daniel Borston, yes, thank you. Borston wrote something kind of along these lines, that the American Revolution was the most conservative revolution in world history, that in fact there was hardly anything radical about it. And I'm sorry I did not have that quote here. Now, I don't know to what degree those two quotes represent, one from 1926, one from 1976, celebrating the same event that we are, but now 50 years even more further out. I don't know to what degree those statements are at odds, perhaps, with even professional scholarship at the time, because on the one hand, there are public-friendly types of events trying to explain the role of the revolution, why it was significant for patriotic terms. We know in 1926, when Alexander Flick is writing that's also Carl Becker and Charles Beard are writing about home rule or who should rule at home. Certainly in 1976, you have a variety of historians, Stoughton Lynn, Jesse Lemisch, Alfred Young, who are writing about a much more radical revolution, calling it a radical revolution in the 1770s and 1780s. So I guess put it into that context. How do we view the revolution? Do we view it as, again, that it's connected to kind of great events and certain founding fathers that push things forward? To what degree are we also, and which we are, but to what degree are we looking also at the role of indigenous peoples, of loyalists, of people of enslaved, of African descent, and their role in the revolution as well? And do they make the revolution? Does the revolution become something not only that impacts them, but that they impact back? And have some power over that. So I don't know. Yes.
So I don't think the revolution was very radical, but I think that what the kind of theme of the 250th has been is looking beyond the American Revolution and how have individual groups kind of forced the United States to live up to the ideals of the American Revolution in the 19th and 20th centuries. But if you do buy the argument that the American Revolution was super radical, kind of like, Gordon Wood's arguments, then you have to think about how native land was at the center of that, because his argument is that, it's the most radical revolution because the common white man gets the right to vote. And that's because there's the widespread availability of landholding in the United States that doesn't exist in Europe. But that land is native land. So it's just something to think about as we commemorate the 250th.
No, I think that's a good point. I'm going to hand it over, but I probably should have also said at some point at the beginning, the passing of Gordon Wood this past week, the giant of early American history, who died in an accident. But let me hand it back.
I should really stop talking, but yeah, it depends on what you mean by radical. Do we mean radical as far as radically egalitarian, or radical in the sense of violence, right? Both in terms of dispossession of Native Americans, but also like it's hard to read like Sung Bak Kim's article on Westchester County and not think like, oh, this is a really radical revolution in which there's like a ton of like Civil War style violence, right, going on in various parts of the state. You've got raids from Canada, you've got you've got all sorts of things going on. You've got like, the beating up of loyalists. I mean, one of the things I tried to do with my book is remind people like it's not just British occupied, it's also American occupied for several months in 1776 before the British come, and they are, beating up loyalists and and forcing them to hide in the woods and swamps and stuff like that. So in that sense, it is a radical, right? It just depends on what you mean by radical. Yeah.
Opens up for different discussion. Chris,
I'll put my Scottish hat on here and say that I think that that's a very American interpretation of it, and makes it the revolution just an American story, but it's not. It's never just been an American story, because it's also an indigenous story. It's a British story, French, Spanish, and Dutch. And in New York in particular, the committees that are formed in 1774 and 75, as Ben was saying, they relied on force, coercion, the systematic violation of individual rights, all the things that they were accusing Parliament and George III of doing. So the provincial Congress that emerges from this process wasn't a natural expression of like popular will, it's the product of a rebellion. And this is a revolution. So when you have William Tryon, he's the royal governor of New York. He used to be the royal governor of North Carolina during the regulator movement. He has to periodically go back to Britain. And when he comes back and things have, everything's hit the fan, he wants to reestablish royal authority in New York. And how is he going to do this? He goes around, he's kind of asked, he goes to Queens, he goes to Staten Island, he goes out to Long Island with these oaths of allegiance and makes people take them. And they're put together in this lovely hand. And the one on Long Island is divided up by town. It gives you their age. They can be as young as 16, as old as in their 70s, gives their occupation. Most of them are farmers. He's trying to reestablish royal authority because this is a revolution, and he's kind of desperate. And he's trying to look or show people back in Britain, look how many loyalists there are. Look at them. There's thousands of them. Look, give me the military appointment. So he's kind of desperate, but New York, he's trying to reestablish royal rule because it had overthrown its government. And that is revolution. Like how radical is a revolution? Like it's a revolution is a revolution. Pretty radical.
And I'll pass it along, Dylan, if you want to add to that, or John. But I was thinking about like Alan Taylor's recent book on the American Revolution, in which he's also making an argument. I already see some frowns from people on the dais here. Don't frown yet. He making the argument that there are many radical aspects to the outcome of the revolution, particularly in a place like New York. If you look at, again, the relocation, pushing out of the Haudenosaunee with the Clinton-Sullivan raid. If you look at the Confiscation Acts of 1778, 1780, taking large tracts of land from loyalists, and from some loyalists who were major landholders like Phillips and Beverly Robinson and others, which led to hundreds and maybe thousands of new landowners, people who had been tenants at a previous time. And also the great migration out of North America, some 60 to 70,000 folks who were loyalists and formerly enslaved of African descent who left with the British. So I'm just wondering, if you factor those in, wouldn't those be radical outcomes? As I'm passing over the microphone, also pointing out that that 60,000 people who left North America in the 1780s and right around the late 1770s and 1780s was a higher percentage of migrants out, higher than France was during the French Revolution. A much larger part, percentage-wise, of the population were driven off. But Brian, Ben, you wanted to.
It's funny because my brother's name is Brian. Well, on the other hand, though, after the revolution, you still have slavery. You still have these feudal landholding systems upstate, right? To the extent that New York has famous founding fathers, they tend to be pretty conservative figures. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, Robert Livingston, right? Like, So, I mean, there is there's definitely a huge faction of New York as it emerges from the revolution who want to, keep things status quo, keep things very hierarchical. So, I mean, the revolution is both. It's complicated. That's why it's so fun to study.
Like talk about the attack of the loyalists and that was already happening on Long Island during the documentation. A lot of people loyal to the Continental Congress for Connecticut. So soon from that same outcome would have happened if the British had the rebel Americans. So that means like with the idea of loyalism is just important, I think, to really understand that a lot of these ideas, like the ideological concerns, sometimes are not as important to that people who are living in like their elements. I think it is important to kind of remember that as just like a baseline when we think about the American Revolution, reasons like larger moments within American state as well.
Okay, great.
Dylan?
Just thinking about the revolution as sort of a moment of opportunity, sort of a window in which change can occur or not occur, especially thinking about that in regards to the type of government that emerges in New York, and not just in New York, but elsewhere, whether that's Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and the differences. But I also think the question of that emerges as to federalism, because the war itself is really important. The type of government that you get at the end of 8 years of war is not the type of government you would get if there was no war. And that's both at the federal level as well as at the state level. And so I think that one of the key dynamics that emerges is that you get 13 very powerful activist, interventionist states to varying degrees. And that's going to, I think, vary, especially when you start to see a divergence between northern and southern regions. That persists at the state level, that then shapes, and I think that thinking of that is that it's New York that is able to basically bully the federal government out of the Haudenosaunee land, or in those treaties, that you have a state that is capable of just ignoring federal dictates. So if you're thinking of that dynamic of what is the relationship, how do you create a federal structure, whether that's parliament and these colonies, or whether that is a central federal entity eventually that will be in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and its relationship with these other entities. Because that dynamic is going to persist well, arguably into the 20th century, in which the states are going to be, if you're thinking like political economy, if you're thinking about development, that will be the actor that is regulating people's lives. And perhaps you don't get that without 8 years of war, like separating the idea of like American Revolution versus Revolutionary War, and that dynamic.
Okay, great. Yeah, Chris.
I'll be quick. It's also important to look at like certain groups of people. Anglican ministers, for example, they thought the war was extraordinarily radical early on. They thought that American rebels were all dissenters, they were all Presbyterians, and they were going to eliminate Anglicanism throughout the colonies, not just in New York. But it's New York Anglicans who are probably the most vocal about it, because Miles Cooper, who president of King's College, now Columbia, he has to leave in May 1775. He goes across to England, he never comes back, but he maintains a very vibrant and active correspondence with Samuel Seabury, Charles Ingalls, John Milner, John Weatherhead, who is a merchant, and they're pleading with him to come back. But he doesn't come back because he can't. And those letters that they send over to Cooper eventually find their way to be published in a pamphlet, anonymized, and sections are removed, like the personal stuff, and these things are standardized, like common editorial practice then. But they're very critical of the British military establishment, in particular the House at the start of the war, and what they're doing, and how they didn't go after Washington after the Battle of Brooklyn or the Battle of Long Island. And they're pointing out like what's happening to Anglicans and loyalists throughout. Like Samuel Seabury, he was imprisoned. Some loyalists were sent down a mine. And there's one in the loyalist compensation claims at the UK National Archives, there's one claimant in particular who says that he was kept underground for 6 months and he didn't see the sun. And these Anglican ministers are committed to this revolution being radical. But in the end, Samuel Seabury goes on to become the first bishop. So he eventually finds his way and settles.
Okay. Right. Now, we're already behind the meticulous timetable that I had put together, and I think it's mostly my fault. But I just want to take one. This will be a lightning round, but much quicker than the one previously. I don't know how many people saw Ken Burns' American Revolution series. Oh, well, not as many as I would have thought, but some. And I saw bits and pieces. I did not see the entire thing, but I was impressed by the degree to which an argument he was making was that the revolution is really America's first civil war and should be viewed as such. Yeah, what do we think?
I mean, David Ramsey says that. It's not a new, it's weird to me that everybody treats that as a recent revelation among historians. I mean, the first generation of Americans all understood it as, understood themselves as having lived through a civil war. Well, right, because the textbooks all kind of follow Washington around and say, all right, he's fighting the British, he's fighting the Redcoats, right? But like, you have to get a little bit more fine-grained, in a state like North Carolina or New York to actually kind of see the movements of, loyalists and patriots and other parties fighting with one another on the ground, and, and families that are split apart, Benjamin Franklin and his son, etc.
Anything after that
Agreed.
spoken to so fully in terms of that. Okay, so as I had promised at the beginning, what we wanted to do for the last 15 minutes or so is to any questions that you may. A lot of hands went up on that, so I'm just going to go in the direction that I saw them. Right here with the green hat, and then the hand that I still see up, and then I thought there was a third there. Then. Okay, I think I can keep this straight so far. Okay, you're up first.
Hello, thank you. This is a question for sort of the panel, but maybe mostly for you, Thomas, since as the editor, you have the overview of the whole volume. And I just want to know, what's the big takeaway about New York and the revolution? What's different about New York? What do we learn from New York that we don't get from New England, or we don't get from the story of the South? Because what I'm seeing here is a mess. I'm seeing this radical burning the city that everybody's in denial about for centuries. I'm seeing the Haudenosaunee fight against the revolution, but they're still there. I'm seeing all these freaking loyalists, or these people who won't commit to either side. I'm seeing the local people who won't support the government in its time of dire need. What's going on here? And you can't say it's complicated. Like, no, one caveat.
It's very
complicated. Already, Ben. It's not complicated. It's got to be something more than that.
What I would say, here's what I'm not saying. It was a civil war in New York. Or that it wasn't. Well, I think folks can speak to it. And yes, I read some 30 papers on this, but my knowledge of the revolution more generally is lesser than many of the people here on the stage. So they certainly can speak to this as well. I think one of the things that you have to think about when thinking about New York, this is my take on this, is that it is one of the few places that throughout the course of the war, you have the two armies within just a few miles of each other. That impacts dramatically what's going on back on the home front in, let's say, the Hudson Valley, or even in northern New Jersey. Those are the regions that are growing the food, that are selling their wheat, selling the grain before the war, right? And now they've lost that market. And so the fact that so it has wide scale, that's why there's a lot of other implications. Most of the food riots which take place during the revolution, which Barbara Clark Smith wrote so eloquently about, take place in the Hudson Valley. And it's related to the same reason, I would argue. New York is a complicated place because it has things such as the manors. And so you have different, the big estates, and some of them actually having manorial status. You have different parts of you have tensions between tenants and landlords, which are not necessarily reflected on the same scale. But you also have the Native Americans, you have the indigenous people in all of the colonies, right? But in force in the western part of New York, which is one of the reasons that you do have the Clinton-Sullivan campaign taking place out there. So my point on all of that is, you're looking at a region compared to something like New England. Once the British are out of New England, it ain't complicated up there. right? There's very little happening related specifically to the war. There's a couple of raids and so forth, and they're certainly trying to support the armies and selling their goods. They're not going, they don't have great deprivations in New England after the war, after the British leave, but New York does. So I think the fact that it's such a tactical battleground, that it has a variety of different implications and impact, has a large loyalist population as well, who may have only been loyalists for the day until the next group came around to change it. Those are a series of factors that very few other colonies have. That would be my take on that. And I'm open to anyone else who wants to agree or disagree. Chris.
I can comment briefly on about sources, because, and going back to the Burns documentary, that was a very Boston story. It was a very Philadelphia story. It's the narrative that people learn and people still learn today. And if you think about the published papers that have been, so you have Washington, it all starts with Jefferson in the 40s, the Adams papers, and you have the Franklin papers. You do have the Hamilton papers, but Hamilton kind of came of age during the war, and before the war he was very young. He didn't do too much. New York offers you can use New York to study almost any aspect of the war, and the sources are there to do that, and they're still there to be mined, to be tapped. And I still think there are lots of opportunities for New York history to develop, not just in 2026, but next year. We've got, as the anniversary of the Constitution, then you go to 2028, 2029. There's lots of opportunities to do more work, and maybe this volume can just, yeah, kickstart.
Maybe the way to think of it is like, you just read Alana's paper. It's a war of conquest, right? Like, it's an attempt to, to arrogate more land. But the other thing is both the British and the Americans are wrong about how vital New York is, right? Like Washington in 1781 has to be held back from trying to take back New York City. And they're like, could you meet the French at Virginia instead? Like, that'll be more effective, right? Like, he thinks New York City is vital, and he eventually has to be like talked out of that. The British, right, with Burgoyne's campaign, if we just control the Hudson-Champlain corridor, we'll win this thing. It ends up being a completely delusional strategy. That seems like George Doggin's book. That seems to be the trendy thing to say, is that actually, like, thinking of New York as being strategically important is like the dumbest mistake you can make. That, like, essentially until you have the Erie Canal, it's Afghanistan on the Atlantic coast, right? Like, and that drives people so crazy that's why you see all of this messiness that Evan is referring to.
Now, next question. I'm going to go here, and then you'll be third. But right back there, Chris, will be the third. Yes. Is there a mic here? Yes. Well, but I can repeat the question if you keep it simple.
And my other comment is going to be on the radicalism of New York during the Revolution. As is the title of my undergraduate thesis, in 1777, General Vaughan described Kingston as a nursery for almost every villain in the country. So the British are recognizing Kingston and New York as a hotbed of rebellion.
Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question quickly. The first question was, is there a way to determine if a specific house was set on fire or caused the fire? And the second was less a question than more of a statement that the British, Vaughan in particular, they burned Kingston because the quote you use, I don't know specifically, but that they are vipers, and they're the nursery for almost every Kingston, go figure. They're a nursery for almost every villain in the country.
Yeah, I mean, which is what, like, and then Kingston, right, the third largest town in New York, is also burned, right, but by the British. I don't have too much more to say about that, except that, like, obviously anywhere that the British are going to burn, they're going to say, well, there were so many patriots there, and then the Americans do that the same thing. Oh, we had to burn Norfolk, Virginia. There are too many loyalists there. But as far as names of people, the newspapers mention prominent mansions on Broadway that were burned, and Trinity Church, obviously, that's a big one. Most of the housing that was burned during the fire of 1776 was on Church of England land, Trinity Church land, basically poorer wooden establishments, people with long-term leases. And so they tended not to be prominent people, and so they're not really mentioned. And there aren't good records saying like, and there aren't like claimant records. Some of them were. Some of the mansions on Broadway are spared, and some of them aren't. And it's mentioned. And so if you get lucky, then they're mentioned in the newspapers. Yeah, we can talk about that later.
The panelists. What do you make of the way different Americans make different interpretations of the American Revolution today when they participate in contemporary cultural and political debates? I'm struck by how in the assaults on the Capitol in 2021, some people were carrying Betsy Roth's flags and Gadsden flags, which date to the American Revolution. Yet this weekend, there will be nationwide demonstrations under the slogan, "No Kings in America." What does this suggest about how Americans have different understandings of the revolution today and why?
I mean, Michael Haddam in his recent book, right, The Memory of 76, basically argues it's always been that way, right? Like every generation of Americans finds a new way to fight about the meaning of the revolution. That's kind of natural, actually. And especially, right, in a country where Jefferson said we need to like reason our way to, to good solutions, right? Like that, we kind of have to fight about it in order to figure out what the meaning of it is. So I'm not so troubled with that, as long as we don't cede to one side or another, right? The ability to claim, oh, the revolution is only what we say it is.
Yeah, I would say like Michael Hatton would have a good answer to this. But even back then, they were using their histories for their own purposes. So Tories, they called them Tories to go back to the English Civil War. So they were using history then as a political tool to mobilize support and to attack other people, and it still happens today.
Going off of that response, back on the Long Islands, they were fighting amongst themselves for like food boils, hatred. So again, it's like Ben says, you have to allow that to happen and not let one side hold the one that goes the other acting. And that's a struggle thing for understanding their own identity.
Okay, there was one more over here, and then I was moving over to this area. But no, okay, then this gentleman right here, but I thought there was someone else who had their hand up in here.
See the promotion? Yeah, thank you. Good evening. I've been reading in the French Revolution recently. And the idea that obviously different set of circumstances, different culture, all of it different, but the French did look somewhat to the American Revolution for some of their inspiration, again, different set of circumstances. And of course, the French financial involvement in the American Revolution tied the French up in knots or contributed to that and the coming of that revolution. I'm wondering two things. First off, in your research, just in your own areas, how much are you coming across in the papers, Rochambeau, Lafayette, or even just French commoners present in America during that time? And I'm also, the other part of my question too is I'm wondering what you might see as relationships between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. A little out of left field, I know, but.
Speak quickly to the fact that chapter 6 of this book is on the French influence on George Washington and leading and moving the army down to Virginia in any case. So there is certainly French influence on the ground toward the tail end of the war, as they really kind of changed the nature of the war. But in terms of, and Tom Paine, remember, goes over and serves in the Revolutionary Assembly, the Revolutionary Congress. Now, I don't know, his book obviously very well read, Common Sense, but at the same time, he's not a revolutionary in the same sense as the kind of founding fathers, a version of the revolution. He has a much more radical approach, speaking about the radicalness of the revolution, but I'll hand it over to.
I mean, if I were going to, this is my area, but if I were going to talk about the French in New York, I would talk about Crèvecoeur during the war. I would talk about Lafayette when he comes back in the 1820s. I would talk about Genet, right? Like a lot of French people wind up in New York, but actually a lot of that story happens after the war, right? Like there's a more interesting story to be told about the French who are hanging out in Newport or in Boston or the military actions that they're performing in Virginia. But I don't think there's quite as much to say about what's happening in New York State and the French during the war. So we're just the wrong people to ask. But
I agree. But what Ben says, when they come to Newport, the Battle of Rhode Island, it doesn't go very well. John Sullivan gets extremely annoyed. Admiral d'Estaing writes a lot of these really nasty letters criticizing the French. They've just come over. It's the first time they're fighting together and things look like they're going wrong. And then when d'Estaing's fleet go up to Boston to repair, they're there for a little bit, but then a French officer ends up being killed because of a riot. And then the Franco-American alliance is tested right at the start, but they're able to survive because the Patriots run this sort of PR campaign to forget about it. And a lot of people like don't know that this French officer was killed. And then eventually they presented d'Estaing with a portrait of Washington to put in a ship. They said, look, everything's all rosy, everything's good. And as the war develops, when the Allied army marches down to Williamsburg and eventually to Yorktown, you have French troops marching with American troops. There's lots of interactions. And because the majority of the French troops and sailors were Catholic, that would have caused some tensions between the Allied armies. But Washington leans on Rochambeau, he leans on Châteauroux, Villamonil, the two Villamonils, for support and advice, especially surrounding with Yorktown. And he leans on them because Washington's never led a siege, but Rochambeau had. And so he leans on him to sort of coordinate the siege. So there's a lot of interactions. On the French Revolution, I'm not too sure. It's a bit beyond me.
I don't understand that as an event, but as an idea, as an idea, and certainly, the world was watching the event. France was watching. They were watching the state constitutions being made. People were participating. I drove up here. I saw the Daniel Ninham statue in Fishkill. I was thinking a lot about him. He fought for the Patriots in the end. Daniel Ninham, he's a Wappinger, Native American, and his lands were taken. I think he believed that he'd be taken care of by this revolution, and the image of the book itself, not too realistic, especially with that dog, but that idea of toppling, kings and tyrants, it's something people believed in. It's what the French believed in. It's what the Irish rebels believed in 98. So the idea, I think you all speak to that radical idea.
Certainly, signed the Declaration of Independence. Well, actually, I was about to say that's going to be my last comment for now. I don't know. We'll bring the session to an end. If you want to speak informally to any of the presenters, that's certainly fine. Want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Make sure Fire and Freedom available at your local bookstore. All right. See you all tomorrow morning.